The Able to Care podcast is sponsored by Able Training Support Limited, who build partnerships with organisations to develop confidence and competence in their team to promote positive outcomes for all. Find the link in the description. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Able to Care podcast. I am Andy Baker and joining me is my co-host Nadine Sutton.
Hello.
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 And special guest joining us today, travelled all the way from Scunthorpe on the train this morning, is Sarah Merriman. So Sarah has got a master's in Dementia Studies and she's been we feel very privileged for her to join us today. We're going to be talking about something very close to your heart, aren't we, as far as some difficulties you went through. But Sarah's had quite an interesting track record working within the charity sector, really. So originally started working with the Alzheimer Society, then you moved on to the Stroke Association, then into breast cancer now. Mind we've got in there somewhere as well. And now you work for the organisation Tide, which is Together in Dementia Every Day. So you do a lot of work around dementia, particularly, is your passion, isn't it? But obviously, the reason we got chatting is because you thought it might be nice for me to hear about your journey being an unpaid caregiver, as far as your nana is concerned. So, well, first off, can you tell us a bit about your family life? What happened leading up to obviously the story with your nana and your situation with your nana?
Yeah, sure. So, growing up, my nana was very much like my mother to me. We were very, very close. She spent a lot of time looking after us when we were children. So I'd always had a close relationship with her. When my grandfather died and when my nana she was about 82, 83 at the time, and it was not long after my grandfather had died. And I used to go and see her. She lived in Lincoln or near Lincoln, so it's about half an hour away. So I used to go and see her regularly and take my children. I've got two children, a boy and a girl. I used to take them over to see her. And when she was about 82, 83, she developed vulval cancer and she went for some treatment for it. She went to Nottingham actually and received treatment for it. And it was at that time that what I now know probably was delirium, but when she was in hospital receiving the treatment, they would ring me from hospital and say, because I was down as a next of kin, and they would say to me, your nana's like not making sense, or she's not drinking enough. Can you speak to her and tell her that she needs to drink more? Because she had radioactive isotopes or rods inserted into her. So you weren't allowed to visit. She was supposed to lie still in this room while this treatment took place. And it became apparent that there were problems there, that she wasn't understanding what they were saying. She was getting very confused. She got up when she was supposed to be lying still. She actually got up and walked to the nurse's station looking for somebody, which should never have happened. So there was a whole issue kind of went on there, but it became apparent when she came back home again after the treatment that, her mental capacity had lessened. And at that time, I was working for the local authority in North Lincolnshire. My children were about 4 and 6, and I was working 4 days a week. But on my day off, I used to go over to see her, and it just became apparent that things weren't quite right. There were carers coming in to help her once she came out of hospital, but there were all kinds of problems started. She couldn't remember if she'd taken a medication, or they would ring me and say, we're struggling to sort your nana out, and I would end up, having to drive over to see her. And then some of her neighbours had my telephone number as well, and I started getting worried phone calls saying, your nana's out in a nightie in the middle of the night in the garden. But at that time, and I know this sounds ridiculous because I'm well educated, I have a law degree, I thought that I thought that I'd got lots of knowledge about lots of things. And when I look back now, I ask myself how I didn't know at the start that it was dementia, but I'd never had any experience of it. And I always say to people now, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah,
so, I knew there was something wrong, but, she would joke occasionally about losing her marbles, and we'd laugh, and I'd just say, oh, you've been through a tough time. It's, it's understandable. So this kind of went on and on from there, really. And that was the start of it, really.
Yeah, I think it's worth circling back a little bit just to the delirium, because obviously there might be some people who are listening or watching who've never heard of delirium as well. Well, I think most people have heard of it in so much as like,
delirious.
Delirious related to a fever, for instance.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's obviously an acute state of confusion. Yeah, that's the definition, isn't it? I was trying to remember that there.
A lot of people don't know that delirium can actually be a marker for emerging dementia as well. So this is the thing. I've been through similar as well. My nan didn't, sure, she lost her speech for just due to other reasons, but she'd lost her speech for a couple of days. She didn't have much awareness, and there was like, well, she's just not communicating. And I was so shocked that hospital staff hadn't even picked up on the delirium side of things. It's, well, she's got an infection. She's usually very verbal and very vocal, but she didn't, so yeah, delirium's massively missed within hospital settings. There's actually research to back that up as well. So yeah.
And it seems to unmask sometimes, doesn't it?
It really
dementia
does.
as well. It seems to, it might have been there before, but it seems to then cause a bit of a deterioration.
I call it acceleration, but yeah.
Is that because it's an easier word to say?
Yeah.
Well, you can tell I struggled over mine, so yeah.
There you go.
Fair enough. You've chosen the right path there, haven't you?
That's it, yeah.
But yeah, so I think it's quite common with, obviously, whether it be related, it's very different from dementia as far as it's acute and it's kind of curable, but it can be unmasking. But yeah, very common with, as you said, she was going through some quite severe surgery and procedures at that point. And also sounds like limited social activity, which is one of the stress factors, isn't it, that increases the risk of delirium as well. So I should imagine that was a strange that you'd never come across that before, and that was a learning curve for you as far as.
Definitely. I mean, I was so angry when they rang me up from the hospital and said, because obviously she was in a side room on her own because they weren't allowed to go in, or they had very limited access because it was, the treatment was radioactive, so people weren't allowed in there. Even the staff weren't. So she was obviously very isolated. She'd already got problems with her urinary tract because, and so she would not drink very much because she didn't want to be going to the toilet all the time. And obviously, that exacerbated the issue. But when they rang me to say, because she had a phone in a room next to her, but when they rang me to say, next time you speak to her, can you tell her to drink more? I literally lost the plot, and I was shouting at them on the phone, and that is not like me.
No.
I was saying, you're responsible for her care. How do you expect me to be able to speak to her? Because there was no mobile phone. I was trying to ring through on a landline, and she didn't always answer the phone, and she wasn't capable of ringing out because it was too confusing for her. So the contact was really limited. And in the end, my sister, who was a staff nurse at the time at the local hospital in Scunthorpe, she rang and basically read the riot act to them and said, you basically make sure you get her hydrated. This is terrible.
Yeah.
And so that was all very, very stressful.
I can imagine.
We literally didn't know from one day to the next whether they were going to tell us she'd died, because bear in mind she was 83 and just to say she was having treatment for vulval cancer, which is not pleasant in itself.
No.
So, we were really, really concerned, but there was just this complete block on us going to see her or even receiving an awful lot of information.
Yeah.
But, but she did make it through, and she did come out the other side. But I think, to be honest, that was more luck than anything else, quite honestly.
Yeah. So you said you started to, when you came home, you started to notice some differences in the behaviour, and yeah, so you were putting them down to just quirkiness, going through a tough time, little bit of disorientation, more to do with kind of just the struggle she'd been through, rather than you didn't connect the dot to kind of cognitive deterioration at that point. So what was the first kind of inkling you had that, this isn't improving, this isn't getting better, and that this is dementia?
It's quite difficult to pinpoint an exact time because dementia is a progressive disease, and also because again, I didn't realise this at the time, but because capacity can vary depending on the day, the hour, it was kind of confusing, because some days I would think she would say really strange things when I'd go to visit, and I'd think, that's really odd. What's she saying that for? And then, then things would change again, and she would seem perfectly okay. So it probably took a while. I'm trying to think back now. I can't even think exactly when I realised that there was something wrong. It was certainly a progression.
We're talking a few months to take it from her coming home, or was it even years?
I think to start with, I thought that it was because of the treatment and because of the medication, and because she hadn't lost my grandfather that long previously. Right. And I think I put it all down to these things, to being grief. She'd moved house. She'd had this treatment. She was on lots of medication for other things. And I think I put it down to that to start with. I think when it was probably months leading into a year. Before. I think when the neighbours rang and said that she was in the garden in a nightie, and one of the neighbours recalled what she'd said to them, something about there was a man in a garden during the night, and he'd been digging a garden up. And then when I went to see her, she relayed that story to me, and I was thinking, well, this is really odd. Why is she thinking that? And, and I would try and say to her, no, there wasn't a man in your garden. I think you're confused. And she'd be adamant about it. And I would just kind of move the conversation on to something else. But so it was little things. I often think with dementia, and I hear this a lot from the carers that I work with, it's hindsight. It's when you look back that you realise. At the time, it's very easy, especially in the early stages, to pass it off as lots of different other things, really.
Do you think that is that something that creates a sense of slight guilt in carers, do you think, that when they're looking back and like in hindsight, I should have known? Did you feel that way, as far as kind of, I should have known earlier, I should have been able to pick up on that stuff? Because I think it's...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, especially now, because obviously, I'm so many years further down the line. I mean, my nana died on the 9th of May, 2012. So, we're talking nearly 14 years ago. And obviously in the meantime, I've worked for dementia charities. I've now got my master's in dementia studies. So all the things that I've learned along the way, I look back now and think, good grief, Sarah, if you'd have known back then what you know now, the outcomes might have been completely different. And yes, I feel guilty. I think, again, that's something we hear from caregivers all the time, is that, they feel guilty. They should have known more. They should have done more, But I always say to them, hindsight's a wonderful thing.
I think as well, though, like the guilt, I understand that. And I understand why probably carers would feel that way. But it's a really difficult one, because if you don't know, you don't know. And like you say, we wish you knew then what you know now. And the outcomes might have been different, but they could have been the same as well. So I really hope that caregivers don't punish themselves for not knowing. But again, that's where raising that awareness and stuff comes out, doesn't it? Definitely.
It's one of the things I sometimes refer to, isn't it? It's like sometimes we're too close to it. So like losing weight by looking in the mirror, when you're growing your hair out and you're looking at it every day and you kind of go, it's not doing anything. But somebody who hasn't seen you for ages can see that massive difference.
Yeah.
And I think that's very similar when you're with a loved one. You may notice little bits or certain things kind of go, here's that different. But then you kind of then rationalize it away and just go, no, they're having a rough day. Or, we're constantly I think with mental health as well, or, you know, with the neurology side of things, it's invisible, and therefore I think people do it with themselves. You know, statistics show that people are far less likely to go to the doctors for any mental health condition or for dementia, because they always think it's all in my head. It'll get better. And it must be for the same for the carers as well, going, it's all in my head. I'm just noticing things. They're fine. They had a good day. As you said, it fluctuates
and
as well.
especially like everything that your nan had been through as well. So you've got grief in there. Grief does very weird, strange things to people. We do have things like memory loss after, because we're living in a different world. Obviously, she's been through lots in the hospital. Delirium, again, being a big, massive one, that can affect people for up to 18 months after, which not many people actually know. So I think as a caregiver, I think you've got every right to have thought the way that you did in that situation, because why would you think it's this big, massive cognitive disease?
Yeah.
Why would you, like, you know, surely there's got to be something else. And again, what does dementia look like? It looks so different for many different people. So that, I think that's the hardest thing about it.
Yeah. I think that must be a tough thing for many of the carers that you support as well, isn't it? The kind of
definitely.
Coming to terms with that and going, I should have known, I should have done more, and all the kind of the hindsight all the time. And as you said, one of your things is, you know, what you don't know.
And I think it was made more difficult because for a number of years, it was my mother, not myself, who was the closest person to my nana. So she was in charge, if you like, of her health. And for other reasons, because I had no relationship with my mother, I didn't know what had gone on before.
Yeah.
So when my mother then disappeared again and I stepped up to look after my nana, there was this whole chunk of her medical history that I was missing.
Right.
And then the struggle became when I started to realise that there were things wrong. I was then trying to contact GPs, and I mean, over the course of her illness, I was trying to contact GPs, solicitors, consultants, social workers, and the answer I always got was, your nana still has the capacity to make her own decisions, therefore we cannot speak to you. And this was the brick wall that I hit constantly. Now, my nana had made a power of attorney, should she lose the capacity to make her own decisions, but the difficulty was, at the time, because power of attorneys have changed since she made them, but at the time, the power of attorney was there, but it had to actually be invoked. So that was an issue in itself. I eventually, as time went on and things became worse and worse, and because I couldn't speak about my nana to anybody who would listen, I ended up going to the solicitors with my nana and saying to the solicitor, look, it's so obvious that my nana has lost the capacity to make like rational decisions, because at this time she was also giving away money, literally lots of money to people who she shouldn't have been giving it to. And I tried to get the social workers involved with the safeguarding. And again, the social workers had gone to see her, and without me present, obviously, had a conversation with her. Then the social worker had rung me and said, we've been to see your nana, and she's admitted that she is giving large sums of money away, but she said it's her money and she'll do what she likes with it. And she's got the capacity to make her own decisions. If I heard that phrase once, I heard it a million times during those 7 years.
Yeah.
And it just became so difficult. So when I'd gone to the solicitor, again with my nana, I spoke to the solicitor on my own and explained what was happening. At this point, my nana was taking like a taxi into Lincoln, and then she couldn't remember where she lived. So she couldn't find her way back home again. And there were all kinds of issues. She was still giving money away. Yeah. She was falling all the time. She was going, like, trying to get out the accommodation in the middle of the night. And she was living at the time in an accommodation where she had her own, because we'd moved her at this point, and she was living in a place where she had her own room and her own bathroom, but she went for her meals in in a central kind of area, communal area.
Yeah.
But she did have the ability, she had a microwave and a kettle, so she could stay in her own room, but she could come and go as she pleased.
Yeah.
So I was arguing that wasn't suitable anymore. But again, I couldn't get, even the people who ran the place didn't want to let her go because, I was viewed as, I think, the interfering granddaughter. She's okay, just leave her be. So, sorry, back to the solicitor. Yeah, I'd gone to the solicitor and I explained all of this. They then made me sit outside while they brought my nana in. My nana spoke to them, and then they sent my nana back outside and took me back in and said, we're not going to invoke the power of attorney because we believe that your nana still has capacity. And I can remember sitting there in that solicitor's office in Lincoln with the tears running down my face, begging this solicitor and saying to her, why will you not listen to me? And she said, I've had a conversation with her and she seems completely lucid to me. And I said, she's masking, she's confabulating. You've got to know the questions to ask her to know that the answers that she's giving you are not the right answers. But the solicitor, they would not accept it. So we went away from there with my nana still having like control of a bank account and again, me not having that power of attorney to be able to speak to anybody on her behalf, be that medical.
Yeah, not be able to support her, safeguard her. Nothing in place. That sounds really massively frustrating and stressful. I can't imagine the amount of toll it took on you at that time. And I can imagine it just felt like smacking your head against a brick wall.
When my mum was supporting my gran, we had a similar thing as far as this. She was very good at masking. She was very good at answering the questions. She was very good at doing the chit chat as well, which is very common with those, living with dementia, that they sometimes, if you go a bit more in depth, they lose it, but they're great at doing, oh, I'm doing well. Yes, I'm good. Thank you. And being able to all the rhythmical speech and those sorts of things. I mean, my mum described a number of times that she would kind of sit in the background and be asking my gran questions and she'd be going, no, just shaking her head, just going, that's not true. That's not what happened. And one of the things that we did that helped is that when she was struggling to get the diagnosis, she basically gave a list of answers of things. And so these are the actual things that have happened. Maybe you could try asking these questions that she should know the answer to. These are the actual answers and see what she then comes out with. And that's was something that helped to kind of get the professionals to kind of listen and kind of go, oh yeah, she didn't seem to give those same answers. She didn't seem to know those things. And I think it's like with doctors sometimes going, what's your date of birth rather than how old are you? There's one's short-term memory and one's long-term memory. And one means that I've been saying this for years and it's autopilot and I need to use very little brain power and memory aid to be able to answer my date of birth. If you ask me my age, that could change from day to day and things like that, isn't it? It's little bits like that if more information was out there, more understanding.
Definitely. And I did at one point manage to get the GP to listen to me, and they sent somebody round. They sent somebody from the practice, one of the practice nurses, I think it was, round to see my nana. And basically, this is what was relayed to me afterwards, because again, I wasn't there at the time. But basically, she went in, and my nana was always very amenable. She's very, very chatty. She would talk to anybody. So this lady went in and started asking my nana questions, and they said that my nana was, chit-chatting away. As soon as my nana became aware that they were asking her questions to test her memory, my nana told them to bugger off. And that was that.
Yeah.
And so because there was that awareness there, and sometimes my nana would actually say to me, especially in the later years, she would have moments and she would say to me, I'm losing my mind, aren't I, Sarah? And, so deep down, she knew there was something wrong. But I would say to her, you're not losing your mind. You've just got problems with your memory. But then that sort of moment would pass.
Yeah.
And she was because so many people are so afraid. So many people are afraid. Dementia is one of those things that people really fear because there is no cure, and because historically, certainly, there's been that stigma attached to it, very much like any kind of mental illness.
Anything we can't see, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think my nana was frightened. She was on her own, and she was frightened of the idea that there was something wrong with her mind. So she would, although she knew that was happening, she wouldn't admit it out loud to anybody, in any kind of medical kind of setting.
My nan would say, I'm okay, I'm not away with the fairies. And she would compare herself to other people as well. So my nan had Alzheimer's disease, and I think in her mind, she hadn't lost a marble. So I'm not like these lot. And I think there still is that stigma and shame attached to it. I don't think anybody likes to be seen losing.
No, yeah.
I'm going to bracket this, losing their minds, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, when I did get hold of some of my nana's paperwork, and this was, while she was still alive, and this was probably towards, 2 or 3 years into all of this, and I found a letter where basically she'd been for a CT scan and on her head. And the CT scan report, I'd read it, and it said something about it's apparent that that this lady has suffered a series of TIAs. And at the time, again, I didn't know what a TIA was, so I Googled it and looked it all up and realised that this then made sense. But what had happened, again, looking through the paperwork, and because I hadn't been there at the time when this had taken place, I was then looking for the follow-up and trying to get in touch with a GP to see what had happened. But it became apparent that a follow-up with a consultant had been requested, but my nana hadn't attended. So, again, she'd fallen off the radar. Yeah. And then obviously, because we'd got so far down that line, that then sort of said to me, well, this is potentially vascular dementia. Yeah. But because we never got any further, it could have been mixed dementia. She could have developed Alzheimer's as well. But that was the clue to me that everything I was talking about was right. Yeah. And she was having a series of falls as well. Yeah. And obviously, again, when you look into it a bit more, and when you know a bit more about it, you realise that this was potentially, these series of TIAs were potentially, causing that.
Thank you for listening to the Able to Care podcast. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, comment, and share. We really appreciate all of you listeners. So it sounds like there was a real kind of challenging journey. So it sounds like you didn't manage to get a diagnosis for your nana until quite late on. Do you know how long a time period it was? How long were you supporting her before you managed to get a diagnosis?
It was 6, nearly 7 years. Wow. Literally. And then it wasn't a formal diagnosis as such. It was, she'd had one of her many falls. She'd literally, I took photos as evidence should I need them later, but she had literally turned one side of her face black and blue. She'd fallen in her ensuite bathroom where she was living, and she'd caught her face on sink as she'd gone down, and they didn't know how long she'd been lying there, but it must have been hours because she was cold when they came in to check on her. She was taken to hospital. She looked like she'd gone 10 rounds with Mike Tyson. I was so shocked when I saw her. And it was at that point that I went in to visit her again in Lincoln Hospital. So because I live in Scunthorpe, it's, probably 25 miles. So it was always like a 50-mile round trip to go and see her. And bear in mind, I was working 4 days a week. I'd got children who were still at school. My husband worked long hours. I didn't have a lot of childcare. So it was really difficult juggling all this. So I was constantly up and down this A15. But anyway, I'd gone to see her in hospital, and when I arrived, one of the nurses had pulled me to one side and said, "We think your nana might have a bit of dementia. Do you think that's a possibility?" And I was literally gobsmacked. I just thought, are you absolutely kidding me? Of course she's got dementia. And I think I actually said that to her. And I literally said, I've been saying this for years. Of course she's got dementia. That's obvious to anybody. And they said, yeah, because she's very confused. She's very this, she's very that. And anyway, then we started having the conversation about discharging her. And they said, yeah, we're going to discharge her back to her accommodation. And at this point, I literally had enough. I'd been quite ill, and I'd undergone surgery a couple of months earlier, and I'd been really, really poorly. And I was only just back on my feet and starting to drive again. And there was just something within me at this point, and I just thought, I cannot carry on doing this. And I literally said, no, you are not discharging her back to where she's come from. She is not safe. It's not suitable. And I insisted that they hold a best interest meeting at the hospital. And again, I didn't even really know what one was. I think I'd Googled it at the time, or somebody somewhere had mentioned it, but we weren't getting any formal support because she'd got no diagnosis. And in the best interest meeting, I brought this up about her dementia, and somebody within the room actually said, oh yes, I think it's quite apparent that your Nana has dementia. And I thought, finally, after nearly 7 years, somebody is actually admitting that. And they said, obviously, we haven't been able to do all the tests, etc. And, but it's pretty apparent that she's got dementia. And that was February 2012.
Yeah, so we hear, again, this quite often, and I'm sure you hear it a lot from caregivers as well. Something quite bad has to happen before that gets taken seriously. So falls is amongst them, and people putting things like plastic kettles on the gas hobs, or, somebody's really injuring themselves or going out at night time and, I don't know, having an incident. Why does it have to get to that level until somebody starts listening and say, oh, okay, there's actually something going on? And just to quote you there as well, a bit of dementia. What's a bit of dementia? I wonder.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was foul.
Yes,
literally,
imagine,
I'd literally got 6 years of frustration, of stress, of anger inside of me.
Yeah.
How I didn't, literally end up shouting at people, I don't know, but it was literally, it was a relief, but at the same time, it was kind of, there was anger mixed in with it as well, and sadness because of everything that, that I'd gone through.
So those 7 years, you were having to manage working, travelling over. So your Nana was still in Lincoln at that time.
Yeah.
So you're having to travel an hour there, hour back, as you sort of said, or about an hour or so.
Or half an hour each
about
way.
Half an hour each way. And obviously you're working at the same time, children as well. How did that impact on you and your family and your health? And
well, it was awful. During that time, I worked for the local authority during that time, and I had 2 jobs at the time. One was an admin job, but I also, so I worked part-time in the Revenues Office, but I also worked part-time as a benefit fraud investigator for the local authority. Now, that was a really interesting job, but part of it was interviewing people under caution. Part of it was carrying out like covert surveillance on people, checking whether people were living together, doing those kind of things. So it required out of hours work. Sometimes I'd have to be up at 4 o'clock in the morning, sat in a car somewhere watching people, or I had interviews under caution booked in that I had to attend. And what was starting to happen was my line manager, who was a friend as well, so that I was really lucky in that respect. She was really understanding, but I would suddenly have to ring her up and say, I can't attend that interview. I need to go and help my Nana out. And it became apparent that, things were really difficult, or I couldn't go and do like prearranged surveillance because, my Nana had needed me in the night. So I ended up giving up that job and just taking more hours in the admin side of the job that I was doing, just because there was more flexibility there. But even then, it was difficult because I think sometimes I would actually I would actually say that it was my kids that were sick, because I felt to some extent like people were thinking, my co-workers were thinking, well, she's off again to see a nana. What's going on? Kind of, do you know what I mean? It was, again, it was 12 years ago. There wasn't, maybe there isn't as much now anyway. And I do hear that from people, but I think there wasn't that level of empathy and understanding necessarily from other people within the team or management who would think, I can't believe she's off again. What's going on? And it just became really, really stressful. I wasn't sleeping because I felt like I could never relax. I couldn't sit down of an evening and have a glass of wine in case the phone went and I needed to get in the car and drive. Not that I drink a lot anyway, but I felt like I could never switch off. I was mentally on call 24 hours a day. So the stress of not sleeping, like not being able to manage everything, feeling like I felt like I was never doing anything well. I felt like I wasn't being a good wife. I wasn't being a good mother. I wasn't being a good employee. I wasn't being a good carer for my nana, because I felt pulled in a million directions and I was trying to juggle everything. So the impact of that was periods of stress where I was signed off work with anxiety, depression. I had brief periods of time on medication, but the medication had its own side effects. So, I would then stop taking that. But I got prescribed Zopiclone to help me sleep. But that was only a short-term fix because they won't let you stay on that for a long period of time. But yeah, looking back, I was a mess, really,
It just sounds like you've had so much to juggle and contend with. And I think a lot of caregivers still feel like that in the position that you was in. I'd still hear it quite a lot. So I'm having to work full time, and obviously in today's society we need to pay bills. That's the stress on its own, isn't it? But then looking after somebody, and what if there is only one sort of sibling or child in that family? So who was supporting you through? So I know you were supporting everybody else as well as yourself, but who was supporting you during that time?
Well, my husband was great. I mean, he was working long hours himself, but he would literally, come home and I would wait for him to come home sometimes. And literally, he'd done a really long day and he would walk through the door and I'd say, the kids have had the tea, I need to go. And he would take over. So he supported me. Without him, literally being so understanding and saying, just go, doesn't matter, just go, I would have really struggled. I've got two sisters and a brother. My brother lives abroad, but my sisters did support me, but they were working full-time themselves. They had children.
In the same boat.
Yeah. I mean, I was only working 4 days a week at the time, so I had that one day and a little bit more flexibility. But they did support me as much as they could. They did help out. And after I had the surgery and was literally unable to do anything for a few months for my nana, my younger sister, she really helped out at that point as well. But, it becomes difficult when none of you have the time. It wasn't like there was one of us who wasn't working, lived nearby, had loads of time spare, to do it. And I think to an extent as well, because I had been so involved for such a long period of time, it became easier for me to carry on doing it. But
becomes a default, I suppose, doesn't it? Yeah, I started, so I'll finish. And it's kind of, it's no negative towards your sisters or anything, but it's a case of, well, you're dealing with that. So we'll be the secondary because you've taken that primary, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think something you mentioned there is, I think, really important. And again, there was somebody very supportive who came and kind of assessed my mum as far as caregiving is concerned when she was looking for funding and support. And they asked her a question like, how many hours a week are you doing? And I think she said, I'll pop down for an hour on a Monday and an hour on a Tuesday. And I sometimes pop down a couple of times on a Wednesday. And I think she worked it out that she was saying that she did maybe 10 hours a week. And whoever it was, I do have to give them the full credit for this. They said, okay, so can you ever go out? Can you go out drinking? Can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do the other? Are you always on call? And if you had any job where you were on call all the time, you'd be getting paid for it. You don't just, if I'm on call, I don't just go, well, it's a reduced pay, admittedly, but, and I think there's so many caregivers out there who only feel they're putting a few hours a week in. But as you said, the times I've got to, as soon as my partner walks in the door, boom, phone call goes, I've got to go. You know, work time, boom, phone call comes. So you could never relax, switch off. So you were full-time plus being a caregiver on top of job, on top of kids, on top of being a partner, running a household. So yeah,
definitely. And I actually looked up, because I worked in the benefits environment, I actually looked into giving up work and claiming carers allowance. And when I realised the joke that was carers allowance, I was so shocked. I mean, obviously I knew about it anyway, but I thought that was maybe so that I could reduce my hours and get that on top. And when I looked at what I would get in a week, I mean, we had a huge mortgage to pay. We had all sorts of bills. We've got the young children. There was just no way financially that I could give up work and claim carers allowance. And, I mean, it was 60 something pound a week. Even now, I think we're only up to something like £67.30 a week. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. And, this is something I feel really strongly about now. Unpaid caregivers, they literally prop up health and social care in this country. And if every unpaid caregiver down tools tomorrow, the infrastructure of this country would literally collapse. The hospitals would be overrun, the GPs would be overrun, social services, and that's the first time I realised that, because if I hadn't been doing what I was doing and my sisters hadn't been helping out, then my nana would have become somebody else's problem. She would have been, she would have been in hospital or in residential care. She would have had to have people coming in all the time. But caregivers carry on doing it because they love that person and because they want the best for them. But, at the end of the day, I say nobody, then in my opinion, they're not regarded highly enough, and it's not valued actually what they do, because people do it still today. People like myself, we take ourselves to the brink physically and mentally. And we break down because we want to provide care for our loved ones, and there's no financial recompense to allow us to do that in a meaningful way. If I'd have been able to give up work and I'd have been able to pop over whenever I needed to, if I'd have been able to go in the daytime while my children were at school, and not have other pressures, it would have made such a difference to me.
I always speak about this. So obviously I worked in care for years and I got paid for it. I loved it, but I thought it was the best job in the world. But I still think caring for another human being is one of the hardest jobs in the world. And I think even more so when it's your own family member. I think it's a lot tougher. I don't know why, because you don't clock off. You never clocked off. At least if I go to a care company and I work there, at least I've got set shifts and I can go home, have a sleep, I can rant about it to somebody else and not feel guilty about that. Like, I've just had a tough day at work, but when it's your family members, I think that makes it a lot tougher. And caring for somebody is it's not an easy job. It's really
emotionally draining, isn't it? You've got your compassion fatigue and things like that demonstrating empathy and staying calm. I think there's a few things in there. One, I think maybe you said from a work point of view, they weren't always as understanding as they could have been. I think that sometimes, is it a perception of if it had been mum, that would have been different from being nana, in the fact that why were you having to do grandmother when that shouldn't that be, and also your family dynamics. Do you think sometimes that whoever the person is, that makes a big difference to the stigma or the perception of people around?
Yes, definitely. I think people would kind of think, well, why does she need to be going to look after a nana? Surely there are other people to do that. And as well, because I didn't have a formal diagnosis for nana, it wasn't like I could say my nana's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or vascular dementia, and so I need to help. It was almost that sort of like, well, why do you need to be rushing off again? Why am I taking your workload or taking extra work because you're having time off again? Or, oh, crikey, Sarah's off sick again. Literally, because there were long periods of time where, months at a time where I was signed off sick because I couldn't cope and I couldn't do both. And I was literally, exhausted. So yeah, that was definitely an issue.
So looking back, as you said, hindsight, a wonderful thing, and you've learned so much, and obviously, Tide as a charity do a lot of work supporting carers. What would you say are probably, if you could narrow it down to like your top, what do you wish you knew then you know now, like the top 3 things maybe?
I wish I'd known that you don't need a formal diagnosis to access support. Back then, I say back then as if it were eons ago, but even 12 years ago, some of the organisations still required you to have a formal diagnosis before the door opened to support. Some still do today, but not to the same extent, because I think there's a lot more understanding around the fact that it can be difficult to get a diagnosis. Diagnosis rates for dementia still sort of hover average around 66, 67%. So there are a lot of people that are living with dementia that haven't got a formal diagnosis. So that would be the number one thing that, that I could have accessed support if I'd known about it. The other thing is, and we hear this a lot as well, that I didn't identify as a carer. I thought that a carer was somebody who claimed carer's allowance that cared for somebody full time. So it never occurred to me that I was a carer because I was working. So I wish that I'd realised that I was a carer. So again, I could have had carers assessments. I could have accessed support, because I was a carer. So that is something that I really wish that I'd known. I just wish that I'd got more information. I wish I'd known more about dementia. I wish I'd been more aware, but I also wish there'd been more awareness with the health professionals that I was interacting with, because I feel like if just one of them had listened to me and been empathetic and kind of understood that my nana had dementia, even though she hadn't got a formal diagnosis, and had kind of, been somebody I could rely on, or somebody that was fighting my corner, I think that would have made a huge difference. So it's not, I guess that's not something that I wish I'd known, but I wish that had been different. I think still we tend to think that, especially those of us that work in the dementia field every day, because we have so much knowledge and awareness, we tend to think that there is this general awareness out there amongst people, and it's when it's highlighted to me, or when I come across that situation, that I realise that it isn't necessarily out there. That there are lots of people who don't. There are lots of people who don't know anything about it, but there are lots of people who have a very basic knowledge, and there is always work to be done, educating and spreading awareness. I think another thing is there is so much information out there on the internet now, and I would say that, all right, we always talk about death by Google,
Sounds like Google's been your friend over the years.
It has to be fair. And there are lots of fantastic organisations out there who've got all kinds of fact sheets, in the dementia world in particular, you've got the Alzheimer's Society and Dementia UK.
Yeah.
And if you go onto their websites and just type in the search bar, something, then you can literally download fact sheets. You can have them sent to you about all kinds of things, and some of them as well have online forums that you can join.
Yeah, I've seen them.
Which again can be really, really useful. So that's something else. At Tide, where I work for, we work exclusively with carers and former carers of people with dementia. So we run peer support groups, and I would say and we also run like free We do free carer development sessions that people can come along to online.
Yeah.
And I think the more you arm yourself with information, the better, really. And you don't need a diagnosis to get to access any of that, and I feel as well that peer-to-peer support element is really, really important. If you can talk to other people that are going through what you're going through or have been through what you're going through, sometimes it's like a light bulb moment. It literally is. When you hear somebody else talk about it, you think, that's it, that's exactly what my loved one's doing. And that's really, really useful. So I would say to people, access that online community as well, and face to face if you've got those groups in your area, because online is great, and it does open things up. When you're a carer and you can't necessarily get out a lot, being able to access things online is really useful. But face-to-face is also really helpful to people, At Tide, we have a closed Facebook group. So we have our Tide Facebook group for professionals, for anybody to go on, where we advertise what we do and, we have information. But our closed Facebook group is only for carers and former carers. And in that group, people can post any time of the day or night, this is what's happening with me. This is what's happening with my mum or my brother, my father, my daughter. And other carers provide, again, that peer support and advice. And that is invaluable. Just feeling like you've got people there.
I think it's a support network for the support network. Like that support's massively needed for those carers, isn't it? Definitely.
As you rightly said in there, other people have gone through similar things. If your loved one is being horrible to you, more than likely you could talk to 1,000 other people that have all had exactly that. If you're struggling to get a diagnosis, you can speak to 1,000 other people who've been through exactly that as well. I think it's just knowing where to look, isn't it? So we'll obviously put a post in. We'll make sure we put a link to Tide and the work that you guys do, which sounds invaluable and a really good support network. But obviously there's anything else as far as putting in some links and stuff like that, if you know of other kind of environments or settings that they can go to, that would be good. We'll put a few other dementia charities in there and stuff on the in the show notes and the comments and stuff. But we just want to thank you so much for coming along. That's been really interesting and what a challenging story you've gone through. And I'm sure there's many people out there who can really relate to what you've been talking about. So hopefully they'll find this useful and take some positive that they're not alone. The thing through the journey.
I really hope so. And I always say that the reason that I do what I do now is that I don't want my yesterday to be somebody else's tomorrow. I don't want the struggles and I would literally say the hell that I went through. I don't want other people to have to go through that themselves, because it literally broke me. And, I see people struggling now in the same ways that I struggled then. And that kind of lights the fire in me to carry on doing what I do, because I feel it's so wrong that people have to struggle like that. And as I say, it's really, really important to me that we change things going forward. And that's why I carry on doing this. So
you keep going.
Over.
Your
passion comes over.
And we're right behind you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you.